I think the new federal government, the Labor government, with its 43% decarbonisation sort of target across an economy-wide target means a much higher target for electricity and needing to carry a larger share of that or a larger percentage of that burden in the decarbonisation. So I think that's very good for the energy sector.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in Australia and California. I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. We have John Cole in today. He's the CEO of Edify Energy, one of the most innovative players in Australia's renewable and storage space. Before Edify, he was a co-founder of Low Carbon in the UK and has also spent time at the National Australia Bank and was a lawyer at Blake Dawson's prior to that. John, welcome to Energy Unplugged. We're absolutely delighted you can join us.
Thanks very much, Hugo. Happy to be here.
Terrific. So just for our international audience, we're recording this on the 20th of June, but we're on slightly unprecedented times here in Australia. And I did want to touch on that before we got any deeper into the podcast. So for the first time across the whole East Coast, the national electricity market, the NEM in Australia, has actually been suspended. So there've been a series of kind of cascading issues. At the core of it was very sustained high prices, concerns about meeting demand. But in some ways, these short-term issues are manifestations of kind of deep structural challenges, but also a decade or more of climate wars. So we are in an unprecedented period here in Australia. John, just to kick things off, any reflections from you on how we've gotten here? And I suppose, how would you summarise the current situation in Australia for our international listeners?
Yeah, well, good question, Hugo. I think, look, in summary, we've gotten here because demand is outstripping supply over an extended period of time. And you did mention ongoing climate wars. Now, I'd like to think that after the last election, they're behind us or getting to be behind us, but obviously inaction, whether from a federal government policy level, has contributed. I don't think it's a controversial statement. And then, one of the interesting points from my perspective is there's probably Australia is amongst a handful of countries, if not, the most resource plentiful country, given renewable resources and call them conventional or thermal energy resources with coal and gas. But despite that volume of resources that we have, here we find ourselves in this energy bind. And so I think there's probably a few things that link to that. One is a lack of planning. Two is there's this sort of lack of diversity of exposure in the resource space, and not only for when it comes to renewables, but across sort of that conventional and renewable space. So we're sort of captured by the commodities that we're totally flush with and exposed to international prices on them.
I mean, it's a tough situation, as you say. I mean, we'll get to the election in a second, but the Australian Labor Party and Chris Bowen, who's the minister, this is only happening kind of 3 or 4 weeks into his watch. So it's certainly a baptism by fire. He's talking about a few different things, more transmission, a capacity market, and we'll get to some of those. What do you think are some of the immediate levers he has to pull to kind of get us out of this short-term crisis, or are there ones available to him?
Well, I think in the short term, there's already talk of market reforms. I think you probably know more about this than I. What's been out in the press as recently as today in relation to capacity market. But I think the question there is the market not working and setting the right price signal? And we look at markets around the planet where we do have capacity markets, and a lower sent out energy price is always sort of attributed to those markets. But then you've got the cost, the all-in cost of your capacity payment as well. So I think we need to sort of look at that generally and say, oh, hold on, is that the right market mechanism for us? And then today, one of the reasons we're here is because the short run marginal cost for our conventional generators is higher than market price cap that EMO put in place up. They said, well, hold on, now we need to set a price scarcity, set the price at 15,000, and now we need to have a price that more readily reflects the consumer benefit, and so we capped that price. Then we had a load of generators saying, well, I can't produce at that price because my SRMC is higher, and so that's sort of, maybe there's a regulatory piece in the short term just to look at the different price cap or how the pricing schedule, Hugo, is set going forward.
Kind of a difficult and in some ways hard to foresee set of circumstances. You touched there briefly on the federal election, and I did want to come to that. So it's been about a month ago. The Labor Party won after 9 years, but I think we touched on this in a previous podcast with Mark Collette, the MD of Energy Australia. I think the other feature of the election was that the Greens did quite well, but that also these independent teal candidates who were funded by climate-orientated organisations won a series of seats in the Liberal heartland, and don't hold the balance of power, but are likely to be influential in the next 3 years of Australian politics. From a political and a policy perspective, it sounds like you're optimistic that we're moving past the climate wars of the last decade or two. What impact do you see the election having?
Gosh, I think that it was, again, and as I said at the start, not a controversial statement. The federal government had sort of made itself bordering on relevancy in relation to what was happening in the market and the rollout of new energy generation. But I think the new federal government, the Labor government, with its 43% decarbonisation sort of target across an economy-wide target, means a much higher target for electricity, and needing to carry a larger share of that, or a larger percentage of that burden in the decarbonisation. So I think that's very good for the energy sector. I think it'll address some of the problems we talked about at the start of this podcast. So I think that's very good. I think there are a load of challenges for this government. Transmission investment, social license for that, timely getting in the right place is something that is where we've got to repowering the nation. Powering the nation, I think, is the or rewiring the nation. Sorry, is the government policy. So I think that's important given the changes in the energy generation mix. I think we need genuine transition plans for communities, supply chains for commodities and components, and scarcity and inflation factors there. And then I think there is a real opportunity for this country to be exporting clean energy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us would like to think that good policy comes out of careful planning in advance. But I think in reality, this current crisis does provide a burning platform for Minister Bowen, but also the state ministers, to make some kind of reasonably significant changes. Whereas the national electricity market as it exists at the moment has limped along for quite a while, basically since the SA blackouts back in 2016, without major reform or overhaul. So, the line "never waste a good crisis" is pretty relevant here, I think.
Yeah, you're probably right there.
Having said that, there has been a kind of fairly major review process going on for a few years now, run by an organisation called the Energy Security Board in Australia. And we've touched on this a few times. That they have talked about capacity markets, but I kind of like to steer clear of that a little bit. The other thing they've argued is for more granular locational price signals. Now, personally, I think Australia already has reasonably robust locational price signals. The grid is long and thin, and a number of renewable assets who've built a long way from demand centres have seen their revenues and volumes hit by things like thermal grid curtailment. But the argument is, at least from the Energy Security Board, that we do need more granular price signals over and above that. What's your take as an investor and builder of renewable projects? Do you think we've got the balance right at the moment, or more granular price signals are required so we build this stuff in the best places across the country?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question too, because from our perspective, we're an independent developer, sort of owner operator of assets, and And one of the things we look at is how do we maximize the value of that asset at a particular point of connection. And we're not really looking at the entire market and others solve the how do we keep the lights on problem. That's not one for us. Our focus is what are going to be the challenges to financing, developing. So we develop new projects, how do we finance them? So we want to try and reduce or avoid additional complexity. So, in a high CapEx, low OpEx, energy fleet market or system, we need to do things that reduce the cost of capital, because that is a really material swing ultimately, or factor ultimately, for the cost to consumers. So we're big believers in keeping things as simple as possible. We weren't big fans of the proposed multinodal solution. We wonder how, when we come to you for a price series on an asset, we're going to be able to finance that. It's hard enough getting robustness and rigor and longevity and curves that endure, let alone having loads of additional analysis with additional factors. So what we propose, we do think it's a challenge. We think there's a bunch of things that can be done in relation to information asymmetry between NSPs and AEMO, and asking developers to look at how have they factored into congestion or constraints in the development stage of the process. And then it was one of the things I'm really proud of, where Edify, or the Edify team, provided really good thought leadership, was in relation to the congestion relief market model that we put forward, which was ultimately sort of backed in by the CEC with some refinements, that said. But yeah, it's how do we try and create that price signal where we can put a value in relation to congestion, both on the party congestion and a party looking to provide relief, work that into the AEMO systems or dispatch systems, and then enable that price signal to come through on a voluntary basis, not a mandatory basis. And then off the back of spot comes contracts. So markets and bilateral arrangements can be struck. So I thought it was a very clever piece of work and thinking, and the more it has been thought through, the more complexity there has been in it. But the team's done a really, really good job, and so let's see whether the ESB and ministers land.
Yeah, so my understanding is that proposal that came from Edify as a private organisation is being taken forward by the Energy Security Board as one of two potential solutions to the kind of locational pricing challenge in Australia. Moving from the big picture to the slightly more specific. So, Edify has been particularly active over the years in the solar space in Australia, but a kind of recent pivot into battery systems. And there's one in particular that's got a lot of headlines here in Australia, but I think will be relevant to other jurisdictions over time. So you kind of developed a couple of battery systems at Riverina and Darling Point. Now, correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong. You recently sold a majority stake in those, but you'll maintain a minority position and manage the construction, commissioning and operation. And I think it was 150 megawatt 2-hour battery. So, a big battery in anyone's language globally. And you also managed to get kind of debt financing from some of the biggest banks in Australia, CBA, Westpac, DNB, and Shell and Energy Australia, who are the two of the big players in Australia's retail market, are on the offtake. What I think was really interesting about that project, though, at least from the outside, were some of the innovative technical elements. So particularly the battery's role in providing grid forming services. So operating in a virtual synchronous generator mode that will provide system strength to a relatively weak part of the grid. Now, I think this is a bigger issue in Australia than anywhere, because our grid is long and thin and fragile in a way that
exactly
Europeans aren't. Can you just talk to us a little bit about the kind of technical side of that project, and then we'll get into the rest of it?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I'm not an engineer by trade, so I'll give you the lay sort of person's view. And just, Hugo, our first foray into batteries was with the Gannawarra battery, which we thought was a big battery at the time, and 25 megawatts, 50 megawatt hours. It's over time, the longer you get in this industry, one of the things I've learned is what we thought was a big project over time becomes a not so big project. The projects just keep getting bigger and bigger. But that was our first foray, and we had been at Darlington Point, we had to bring 2 synchronous condensers, so 75 MVA of synchronous condenser capability to complement the solar farms operations there. And that caused us to pause and just sort of say, look, how do we try and bring a different solution to this problem? So we're not looking, it was do no harm, but how do you actually try and do good? How do you add net benefit to the network and not just sort of keep it in an as is position without having done any harm? So as big believers in power electronics and needing to harness this technology, if we're going to get to 100% renewable grid, we need power electronics to provide functionality that can keep the network stable. And so that essentially is what we've done. So the Tesla Megapack, so the inverter, has a virtual synchronous generator mode. It can mimic what a conventional generator does to provide system strength voltage support. Others better place than me to talk about the specifics, but basically network support or strengthening services. And it's debatable, depending upon whether you look at the views of our consultants, NSPs, or the market operator, as to just the volume of megawatts that battery supports, but it's in the hundreds. That's definitely common. Is it 300, 500, 700? That's where sort of the debate is, but it does enable in that part of the network by virtue of the battery providing system strength as an inherent part or inherent characteristic of it. It does enable more renewables to be connected to the network, and so yeah, it's very good. It's good, and it's just that it's the next evolution, and there'll be a future sort of evolution of that again.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly as we're kind of losing our coal plants at an increasingly rapid rate, and issues around inertia and other issues start to raise their head. Just to give us a sense, so is the battery being compensated for that? And then also, I know there's an offtake agreement, but dispatching into the wholesale and ancillary markets too, is that what the revenue stack looks like for that asset?
Yeah, no, this asset, so on the revenue side, the contracting structure is not dissimilar to what we did at Ganawara with Energy Australia. So this was a second services agreement, as we call them here. So basically Energy Australia and Shell have full dispatch and control rights of the asset, of the battery. And one of the reasons for that is, whoever's best placed to manage that risk and optimize it should take the risk and have the benefit of that. And they're the parties with portfolios and customers and so on and so forth. So that's the revenue line. There isn't a distinct revenue line for system strength services. We are a believer, though, that the markets will evolve for those services, and we think that battery or batteries like this will be very well placed in the future to take advantage of providing those services to meet the needs of the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think location-based system strength markets are a little bit of an inevitability in Australia. And Paul Simshauser has written this in Queensland, but I think there is a market solution, but it is going to require some kind of regulatory reform, as you say.
Yeah, but that's I mean, in my time in Australia, Hugo, that's one of the things that has changed, I think, and some of our learnings. Once upon a time, we were connecting at a point of connection. You sent out generation times MLF times price at the node, swapped out with a contract or not. But you need to be more sophisticated about that than that today. And where are you looking to put your generator, and what services are you looking to provide today, or where do you think the market will evolve for those services? And sometimes places that are the more difficult to connect can actually be the more fertile.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things that this sort of generator does is it should enable a smoother path through the grid connection process, because you're not doing harm, you're actually doing good, and it's a net benefit.
Yeah, and again, for our overseas listeners, Australia, like a lot of markets, has a relatively long grid connection process that requires quite intensive grid modelling. So anything that can shorten that will certainly be helpful for deploying renewables. John, I certainly spend a decent part of my life going to see the major project finance banks in Australia and talking to them about markets, but particularly talking to them about storage and flexible investment cases more broadly. And again, I think Australia, because of its highly volatile market, settles at 5 minutes, duck curve shaped price intraday, is at the kind of bleeding edge of battery investment cases. You've obviously got, as you said, an offtake here, but is your sense that the kind of project finance community, at least in Australia, is getting up the curve on battery projects, and that there's been progress there, and that's going to be an investment, a technology class that group is increasingly comfortable with?
Yeah, I mean, no two projects are the same, Hugo, and it depends where you are, but for banks, you want to de-risk. If you've got a project with a load of risk in it and a load of equity upside, call it merchant exposure for want of a better term, then that traditionally is one to get bankers. It's more difficult to get bankers comfortable with, because they like certainty of cash flows, more infrastructure style investments. And if you've got long contracted assets, then bankers, project finance bankers, generally love those style of assets. And a battery, like a other renewable plant, can be a mix of those things. In this case, we had highly contracted projects under this sort of services agreement arrangement, as I said before, where the risks were best held by the party that could manage them, and the banks like that. They did like that, and so it was not a no deal that's easy to finance, but the revenue contracts were definitely a part of the project, as well as how it was put together. Otherwise, it was appealing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems the other thing in Australia that is increasingly, as you say, the contracting structures are incredibly important. But when you do look at the returns on merchant batteries in Australia over the last 3 to 4 years, most of them have paid their capex off within that period. Now, that has been driven by some unusual volatility in both wholesale and FCAS markets, but that's a pretty extraordinary kind of rate of payback. Given the volatility we're seeing at the moment, different investors are clearly getting more comfortable with batteries as an investment case.
I think so. I've said for a while, Hugo, that if you've got a merchant battery, it's about conviction investing. You either believe it or you don't. You either believe in the spread, you believe the volatility, you believe the services and the multiple revenue lines that can come from this style of asset in the network, or you don't. And if you do, you need to be investing, and if you don't, you shouldn't. And banks are somewhere in the middle in that regard, by way of just the certainty of the cash flows and what can be financed. But yeah, fortune has favoured the brave, or first mover advantage, if you want to call that, in this market. We've got a view, and one thing we're executing on, and it's just based on our experience with solar, as we've tried to look at the risks that have manifested themselves in the assets that we've financed and manage and keep an ownership stake in, as is our business model. But how do we try and reduce those risks and enhance value? And we think it's one of the ways to do that, is very much through the combination of solar and batteries, and how you connect them up, and you get the benefits of that cheap energy generation that solar provides, as well as the dispatchability that you get from batteries. So the main question we ask ourselves through our project sort of design and development is, how can we enhance value and reduce risk?
Yeah, and I'd say Edify, in the Australian context, alongside Neoen, Iberdrola, and a few others, has been at the cutting edge of thinking around diversified renewable portfolios with some degree of dispatchable flexibility embedded in them, and that's clearly the kind of the frontier in Australia, and where the more sophisticated market participants are going, I think.
Well, I think the country needs energy. You have your views, and we've probably gone through a period where the price signals to the market, from 2018, 17, 18, renewable, the price of electricity only went down, and it wasn't quite sending the right price signal. Maybe there's something else that needs to send the signal to begin investment. But we've seen that turn We've seen that turn now, but ultimately it's not just about storage. The country still needs energy. Demand for electricity is on the rise, or that's definitely our house view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is kind of one of the major analytical challenges that I see. So as I said, Australia has a reasonably extreme duck curve, and a lot of that is driven by our very high rooftop solar penetration. We've been building somewhere between 2 to 3 gigawatts of rooftop solar a year. So you do tend to see prices that are lower in the middle of the day. But then there is this question around how is demand going to evolve? So, most analysts say that if you're going to decarbonize the rest of the economy, demand's going to go up 2 to 3x. At the same time, if you take a price forecast to a project finance bank with 3x demand baked into it, that won't necessarily be considered bankable. And so there is this slight chicken and egg problem. We think, or we strongly suspect, this additional demand's coming, and therefore we need the bulk megawatt hours provided. But in the interim, we are seeing particularly solar, but also wind cannibalization in this country. And that is kind of, muting the investment signal in what is still a very, volatile merchant market.
Yeah, look, I really like wind turbines, and I did some wind in a previous life. But if you're running an independent development business like we are, just the working capital and the gestation period for the projects take longer. So that's why we've sort of been in solar, and now big believers in this combination of cheap solar and dispatchability, all of which sits behind a very smart set of grid forming inverters that can provide the network services. And that's, we ultimately need that combination. We can only do it from our perspective as a developer and designer of a single asset. Whereas if you're government, you can look at doing that from a res perspective with wind, solar and storage and so on and so forth. Otherwise we will end up with cannibalization. It's funny, isn't it? Certain asset classes are flavor of the month from time to time. So we'll see.
To pivot a little bit and talk about your career, you've kind of co-founded 2 very successful renewable businesses in both the UK and Australia. I suppose, what's been the hardest part of each of those processes? And were the same things hard each time, or did it get hard in different ways as you did each of them?
I think startups are hard. Number one, you've got to be ready for a very white-knuckled ride. And I don't know if we ever bet the farm at any one point in time, but we did have a few sliding doors moments along the way. I think one of the learnings is that when we were in the UK when I was there at Low Carbon, so 2010, 9, 10, 11, 15, I thought we were in the energy market, but for the first part of that, we were farming sort of a green benefit. It was the feed-in tariffs and ROCs, and they made up the vast majority of the revenue line, and your off-takers did all the hard work for you when it came to managing the electricity. Whereas in Australia, with a pooled market, energy only, you didn't need that off-take agreement for your route to market. So you're very, very much in the electricity market here. So I'm sure that position has evolved, and the guys at Low Carbon would have a different view today, but that's one of my insights. I think the construction risk from Australia to the UK was very different as well. The projects here are just much larger, the tyranny of distance, the logistics exercise, all of that. And what are the insights? I think you need to be bolder. Even when you think you've set yourself a hairy, audacious goal, it can probably be bigger. Teams are so fundamentally important. It's the team, and we have such an awesome team of people here. I'm very blessed to have the team that we have at Edify and the capability. I think there's something in partnering and collaborating rather than just transacting. Yeah. And then just the courage and your convictions, because there's a lot of times it was difficult. We used to, we'll run a piece of a analysis where we say, well, what's the project need? And that's your capital cost, basically, with your and then your cost of capital, and run it out. So I need X dollars a megawatt hour to make it work. And then what's the project worth? And then you look at it, the forward curves into the market, and there was a gap that was difficult to bridge. But you've got to continue thinking that, hold on, this is I'm in the right business. We're going to be on the right side of history, and we're doing this for all the right reasons, and continue to crack on. And so, yeah, hopefully we're seeing sort of those price signals turn, and unfortunately, we've got high inflation, low FX, higher commodity prices, which are creating a sort of different headwind to that tailwind. But just keep your head down and keep going. Believe in what you're doing.
You do seem to have a crack team there at Edify. They seem like the kind of guys who do write quite complex market reform suggestions in their spare time and then submit it to the regulator, which is obviously not every organisation out there.
No, they I think Andrew Steele and Manus Chowdhury have sort of led that charge, and we're looking at that problem. We're actually one of the reasons why we ended up in this writing the long submission is that the Gannawarra battery and the Gannawarra solar farm sit literally side by side each other. They're hundreds of meters apart, 100 meters apart. And they have a private network that connects into the power core 66 kV network. But when AEMO applies a constraint, it doesn't apply to the 66 kV point and connection such that the solar farm can charge the battery. It applies them on both. So at a time when we should be looking to move energy from a solar facility into a battery to dispatch it when the market needs it, both assets are constrained off, which is madness, if I can say that, or a room where reform was needed. And that we're sort of looking at a bilateral arrangement, and ultimately it evolved into this market-based solution.
And we're jumping back into market reform a little bit. I mean, I've always got a certain degree of sympathy with the regulators in that it is very hard to stay in front of energy market innovation and get policy settings right as investment and business cases are still evolving. How do you think that AEMC and others in Australia do in terms of, when you identify an issue and a clear inefficiency like that, the pace of response and then rule changes? And, was Ofgem better maybe at kind of identifying issues and moving faster?
Oh, that's a hard one for me to pass comment on in relation to Ofgem, because, as I said, we're in a sort of a different part of the power system, or a different stage of its evolution, if that makes sense. At that time, the projects were so much smaller too. I remember standing on a 5 megawatt solar farm thinking, now this is a power station. And and it was, but it wasn't. So the comparison's a hard one. Look, I think people are trying to do their best. There's so many vested interests too, and we're in the middle of a transition, and we're trying to adapt and create rules that work for the new world and not the old world. And some incumbents don't like them, and sometimes it just requires a sort of fresher mindset or a different sort of thinking to help get through those and implement the solutions. So I think everybody's trying to do a good job. Hugo.
No, I completely agree. I mean, the one reflection I do have when I look between the UK and Oz is the governance framework in the UK. If you can get the Minister Bays and Ofgem lined up, you can do almost anything relatively quickly within reason. In Australia, because of the state-federal split and because of some legacy around the governance, there are just more parties. So any rapid rule changes are challenging, I think.
I agree with that. The last point, and there are a lot of bodies involved in regulating this sector. We sort of see some fusion up in my mind. Some of the older which bodies doing that. There's a definite blending. It is a challenge with a number of stakeholders engaged or involved. And what we would like, Hugo, is where we've got solutions that are very good for the electrons. Like, it makes just good electrical sense. So the example I gave before, that the Gannawarra solar farm shouldn't be constrained off from charging the battery when there are no electrons actually making its way onto the power core network. That's a sensible solution. We've got to find a way through to make that sort of thing happen, not just for that generator, but for all sort of generators like it and the way they're set up. And so, what is a really good, efficient solution for the electrons, and that should be sort of a guiding principle.
One final question then, and Australia is, I think, blessed with a number of great energy thinkers, but is there anyone you read or listen to in Australia or globally that you always think is good, thought-provoking and relevant to your life in the private sector? Is there anyone that springs to mind?
I mean, I really enjoy listening to Alan Finkel. So I like what he has to say. He challenges and causes you to think a bit more deeply. And I've recently read the David Attenborough book, A Life on Our Planet, and that was inspiring. confronting and inspiring, but it's all about the electrification of everything. And then there is a good podcast, maybe not as good as this one, but it's Australia. If you're listening, it's an 8-part podcast that sort of tracks the history of climate policy in this country, and that's really insightful as well. So I've enjoyed that recently.
Awesome. And for our overseas listeners, Australia has a chief scientist, and Alan Finkel was the chief scientist a year or two ago, but played a very active part in energy debates and is an amazing thinker and person. John, that's been terrific. Thank you enormously for your time. We've covered a lot there in half an hour or so. I know you're one of the busiest people in Australian energy, and we're enormously appreciative of your time. All the best, and thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Hugo.
That was Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in Australia and California, talking to John Cole, CEO of Edify Energy. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.